Today,
I'm
we're
so
diving
glad you're
deep into
here
the wild,
because we're looking
totally
at a
volatile
piece of
rags to
history
riches
that is
journey of a
literally
literal
hidden in plain
American
sight.
fashion icon.
We're going to explore
Calvin
the
Klein.
fascinating
We're
story
going
of
to
how a
decode the
simple,
absolute
mass-produced
terrifying
appliance,
lows and the
something
soaring
you
highs
probably
of his
have sitting in
career.
a closet right
Why?
now,
Well, to
actually
extract his
rescued the
$700 million
American South
empire-building
and made
secrets.
modern
We're
urban
looking
life
at the
as we
exact
know it
strategies that
possible.
took him from having literally
To
nothing
really
to building
grasp
a
why this
massive
matters,
global
we have to travel
dynasty.
back to a time before
Seriously,
cooling
think about it
technology
for a
even
second.
existed.
How does
In the
someone
summer
with
of
zero
1896,
family money,
a brutal
and absolutely
10-day
no
heat wave
connections in the
basically
garment
parked
district
itself over the
pull off
eastern
the
seaboard.
impossible?
In New York City alone,
how does a
temperatures broke
quiet kid
100
working in a
degrees.
Bronx grocery
Horses were
store
collapsing
take
on
a tiny
Broadway,
loan
and city
and
morgues
spin it
literally
into a
ran out of
$700
space
million
in just
fashion
72
empire?
hours.
Let's
Over in
figure it out.
Chicago, workers were just dropping where they stood.
$10,000.
When it was all
That is
said and
it.
done,
That's
more than
all it
1,500
took to get this
people
whole
had died.
thing off the ground.
These were the
It
desperate,
started back in
absolute life or
1968
death
with this
stakes
tiny
of 19th
19th
century
capital loan
heat.
from his childhood
So,
best friend, Barry
let's
Schwartz.
dive right into
Just
part one.
two kids
The
from working class
unbeatable
families,
Southern
right?
heat.
But they trusted each other enough to take a massive
wasn't
leap
just
of
a
faith.
mild
They
discomfort.
rented this
It was
tiny
a
Manhattan
massive
hotel
physical
showroom with
roadblock
pretty much
to
nothing
urban
but a handful
development.
of coat samples.
Back in 1880,
and honestly,
northern
just
cities
a
like
lot of
Chicago
nerve.
were absolutely
Now,
booming,
fast forward
racing
a few
past
decades,
500,000
and that initial
people.
10
But if you
grand,
look down south,
it exploded
Atlanta had maybe
into an
37,000
exit
people.
worth nearly
Houston was basically a small trading post of about $16,000. Why?
But,
Because
and
the
this
relentless
is absolutely
95-degree plus southern
the
summers
path to that
physically
$700
blocked
million
these
finish
cities from
line
growing.
was
Workers
not
would
a
pass out on
straight
factory
line up.
floors.
Oh,
Downtown brick
no.
buildings turned
It
into
was
105-degree ovens by 2 in the
rollercoaster.
afternoon.
Honestly,
it was so
it's a
oppressive
true
that state
masterclass in
legislatures in Austin and Baton
endurance
Rouge
and survival
would
in
actually
what is
shut down
easily
and
one of the
adjourn
world's
for the
most
entire
unforgiving
summer,
industries.
just because their
So
buildings
picture
were
this
physically
stark
unbearable.
contrast.
Because of
You've
this,
got the
Southerners had to
cutthroat,
adapt.
hyper-trendy
They
fashion
basically
world of
turned
7th
survival
Avenue on one
strategies
hand,
into everyday
and then you
design
have his
choices,
roots.
building their
While other
entire
kids were out
architecture
playing
and
stickball,
daily
Calvin
rhythms
was
around the
quietly
heat.
absorbing these
You had
incredible
shotgun
practical
houses
business
built as
lessons
these long
right
wind
from his
tunnels for
father's grocery
ventilation.
counter in the
There were
Bronx.
dog trot
He
cabins
just
with
watched his
central
dad price
breezeways where
merchandise
families
and calculate
essentially
value
lived
in his
from
head.
June to September.
He was basically getting
You had
his
sleeping
rock-solid
porches
foundational
and
business
incredibly
education
wide city
right in the
streets
middle of a
designed
working-class
purely to get
neighborhood.
some air circulating.
And you know, that
The
early
whole rhythm of
experience
Southern life
forged our
bent to the
very
heat.
first empire
But that also
building
meant they were
secret.
stuck in a
You have to
slower economy
combine
compared to the
art with
vertical,
commerce.
dense industrial
he
north.
learned the
The
meticulous
South was
art of
culturally
garment
rich for
construction
sure,
from his
but
grandmother,
they were economically
Molly. She
trapped
was a
by their
tailor.
own climate.
But the grocery store,
Which brings
that
us
taught
to
him the commerce
section
side.
2.
He realized
$5
super early on that having
technological
great taste
revolution
means
absolutely
in
zero if you
1882,
can't actually
a
run a profitable
22-year-old
business.
engineer named
You need
Schuyler
both
Wheeler
if you're
did
going to
something
scale.
incredibly
So
simple.
after 5
He attached
grueling years
two
just trying to
exposed
survive this
blades to a
7th
small
Avenue snake
electric
pit,
motor.
which
It
basically
had
meant
no
he was just
cage, it
copying
didn't
European
oscillate, it
designs
was
from
essentially
mid-market
just a
companies.
dangerous
He
bare
finally
motor
strikes out on
whipping
his own.
air across a
And
desk.
then,
But
the
as
ultimate
alternating
lucky
current
break.
grids spread
A
across the
buyer
country,
from Bonwick
thanks to
Teller
folks like
accidentally
Edison,
wanders into his
Westinghouse, and
rented hotel
Tesla,
showroom,
massive
totally falls in love
manufacturing
with his coats,
competition
and
took
places an
over.
order right on
By
the spot.
1894,
That
Emerson
one single
introduced
chance
the
encounter
oscillating fan,
basically
which
catapulted his brand new label to $1 million
and by the late
in sales within a
1890s,
year.
General Electric
Crazy, right?
thankfully added wire
Now,
blade
that
guards,
kind of
making them
massive
actually
overnight
safe to
growth
use in
requires
homes
a
and hospitals.
huge shift in
This
mindset.
relentless
And
competition
that brings us to
drove
Empire
innovation
secret number
forward
2,
at lightning
sell the
speed.
identity.
But there was a catch.
If you want to scale
Wheeler's
to a
original
$700
desk
million
fan cost about
valuation,
$40.
you can't just sell clothes.
Now, that might not sound like much
you have
today,
to sell a feeling.
but back then,
And he
the
did this
average
so
American worker
masterfully
made
in
just
the late
$400 a year.
He literally took
That
denim,
means this
a
fan
fabric
was a
people
luxury
used for
novelty
painting
reserved
fences or
for
fixing
Manhattan
cars,
bank
and
presidents.
transformed it
It'd be the
into
equivalent
a
of
super
spending over
premium, sexy status
$350
symbol,
today.
just by
So
slapping
it was
his
a
own
rich
name on the
man's
back
toy.
pocket.
While tenement
And the
families were
metrics of that
sweltering just 5 blocks
1978
away.
jeans launch,
The real
they
turning point
completely
wasn't
defied
actually
the
logic.
invention itself.
The demand
It
was
the
so
precipitous
insane
drop
that during
in price.
his fall
By
fashion
the
show,
early 1920s,
buyers placed
a
an
working-class
astonishing
family in Memphis or Birmingham
in
could
orders
walk
in
into
just
a hardware
48
store
hours.
and buy a reliable
I mean, they sold
oscillating fan for $5 or
200,000
$6
pairs in the very
Suddenly,
first week
it was
alone.
a reachable weapon
It created
against the
an
Southern
absolute
heat.
cultural
And this simple price
explosion
drop
that pretty much
set the stage for
redefined
one
the
of the most
entire apparel
overlooked
industry
transformations
overnight.
in all
So
of
how do you
American history.
sustain that kind of crazy
And
momentum?
that leads us to
His
section
philosophy was
3,
actually pretty
how
simple.
fans rebuilt
He said
cities.
the only way to
People in the
advertise
South
is by not
started
focusing
buying
on the
these
product.
newly affordable
Right?
$5
In 1980, he
fans by
leaned
the
super heavily
literal
into shock
trainload out of
advertising.
Sears
He put out this
catalogs.
highly
And the
controversial economic
campaign
impact
featuring a
was
15-year-old
just
Brooke Shields.
staggering.
Now, it faced
Picture a
intense
brick
public
textile
backlash. It
mill in
got
Charlotte
notoriously
in
banned by a
July.
bunch of networks.
It's over
But
110
purely from a
degrees
business
inside,
standpoint,
and they're losing
the sheer
40%
volume of
of their
controversy
production.
generated
So
this
factory
massive,
owners started
unstoppable
bolting
cultural
oscillating
attention.
fans
It was
to the ceiling.
genius.
Now,
But
the fan
then
didn't actually
we
cool
hit
the air, but
1983,
moving air
and
evaporates sweat,
absolute
which
chaos
makes it
hits.
feel about
At the total
15
height of
degrees
his jeans
cooler.
fame, he
That
didn't actually
perceived
own
drop
the
was
manufacturing
enough to
company that was
restore
making them.
production and
So what does he
stop
do?
workers from
He
collapsing.
executes this bold
Meanwhile,
but honestly
department
super
stores like
reckless,
Foley Brothers in
leveraged
Houston
buyout.
started
He took on
advertising
massive
themselves
amounts of
as
borrowed money
cooled
just to
by
buy the
fans to
manufacturer
drive foot
outright.
traffic.
And the timing?
And here's one of my
Absolutely
favorite
disastrous.
historical
The whole
twists.
jeans craze cooled
Theaters
down
in
almost
Dallas and
immediately
New
after,
Orleans
and it plunged him
installed
right
massive
into a
fans to
terrifying
blow air
existential
over
crisis.
huge blocks of ice
62
to draw crowds. million.
That combination of
sink in.
fans and ice?
Suddenly,
That is
the man whose
literally
name is
what
towering
invented
over
the
Times Square on
Hollywood
these
summer
40-foot
blockbuster season.
billboards is
But it wasn't
drowning
just
in
about money or
$62
movies.
million
Before the
of
electric
crushing,
fan,
high-risk
up to 300
junk bond
out of
debt.
every 1,000
Everything he had
babies
poured his
born in the
entire life
poorest,
into building
hottest wards
was
of
now
New
just
Orleans
teetering
didn't
right on
survive
the
their
edge of
first summer.
total
It's
liquidation and
completely
bankruptcy.
devastating.
His
But
whole
as those
legacy
$5
was on the
fans
line.
made their way into working
And the
class
hits
shotgun
just
houses,
kept coming.
public health records
The
show
1990s brought
a
this
profound
suffocating
drop in summer
cascade
infant
of
mortality
crises.
and heat
Look at
stroke
this.
hospitalizations.
In 1992,
a cheap
the
spinning
bill for
motor
that
was
massive
literally
debt
keeping
finally
babies
comes due.
alive through those
He gets
suffocating
miraculously
August
bailed
nights.
out by his friend,
And the
the
numbers
music mogul
brilliantly
David Geffen.
illustrate the
But
macro
then,
result
right
of
as he
all
launches
these
his
fans.
big comeback
An
in '94,
absolute
he walks
population
directly
boom.
into another
From
major
1880
scandal
to
over a
1920,
provocative ad
Houston
campaign.
skyrockets
It even
from
sparked a
16,000
preliminary
to
FBI investigation.
138,000
And
people.
all of this is unfolding
Atlanta
while he's
triples to
battling
over
his
200,000.
highly public rehab
Dallas
stints.
surges to
It was just an
150,000.
overwhelming
The electric
storm.
fan allowed the South to survive,
So how
function,
in the
and
world
aggressively
did he
scale
fight
its
his way
population?
out of that storm?
It turns summer from
that
a
leads
season
us
of
directly
pure
to
survival
Empire
into
Secret
a
number
season
3.
of everyday
Invent
normalcy.
a new category.
Now for section
Rescued
4.
from the financial abyss by
The air
Geffen's
conditioning
bailout,
Klein
takeover.
realized he had to prove
In
to his creditors,
1902,
to the
a
retail
25-year-old
world, and
engineer
honestly
named
to
Willis
himself,
Carrier
that his
accidentally
creative instincts
invented
were
modern
still
air
razor
conditioning.
sharp.
And
He had
get
to do
this,
something
he wasn't
entirely
even trying to cool
unprecedented.
people down.
Instead of
He
playing by
was
the
working at a
established,
Brooklyn
boring
printing
rules
plant
of
where
traditional
fluctuating
men's colognes
humidity
and
was
women's
wrinkling the
perfumes,
paper
he
and
completely
completely
defied
ruining color
conventional
lithography.
wisdom.
He
He created
designed a system with
CK1.
chilled coils
It
to
was
dry
this
the air
raw,
and stop the paper
minimalist
from
product
warping.
that just
The fact that the
ignored
air
gender
came out
entirely.
freezing cold,
He
that
basically
was just a
invented the
highly
completely
convenient
new
side effect.
category of the
For decades
unisex
after that,
scent.
Carrier's
And
invention
he
was just a
marketed it with
massive,
these stark,
expensive
documentary-style
industrial tool
ads
used
featuring
mostly in
unpolished,
textile
highly
mills
relatable
and tobacco
models.
warehouses.
It was
By
totally different from
1925, it
anything
started
else
hitting
out there.
Broadway theaters.
20.
But the real shift happened
That
after
single
World War II.
unconventional gamble
In 1947,
paid off
about
so
43,000
spectacularly
compact
that
window
at its
units were
absolute
sold.
peak,
But jumped to
20 bottles of
1953, and
CK1
competition
were
mixed
being
with a
sold
suburban boom
every single
pushed that
minute
number to
of the
over
day.
1 million
Every
units
minute.
a year.
It
The
brought
price
in
dropped,
roughly $90
financing
million
plans arrived,
annually
and
by the
AC
mid-90s.
absolutely
It
flooded
completely
middle-class homes.
cemented one of the
This
greatest,
ushered in
most
a
lucrative
completely
business comebacks
unprecedented
in fashion
cultural
history.
transformation.
But
You see,
the
the
fan
what
had
happens
always
when the
assumed
pendulum
your house
swings
was
back
connected to
and
the
public
outside
backlash
world.
hits yet
You
again?
utilized open
Well,
windows,
this brings
sleeping
us to
porches,
Empire
and
Secret number
breezeways.
4.
But AC
Survive
required
by
the
stripping
exact
down.
opposite. Whether
It
you're
literally
building a
sealed
multi-million
houses
dollar
shut.
business or
Builders
honestly just
completely
managing
stopped
your own
including
sleeping
projects.
porches and
When everything
piazzas,
around you
the
goes
front
crazy,
porch, which
the
had
secret
always
to
been the
survival
social
is to
center of
block
Southern
out
life,
all the
where
noise
neighbors
and double
talked
down
and kids
on your
played, was
absolute
completely
core strengths.
abandoned.
As
AC
they
moved
say,
everyone
simplicity
inside
is the
behind
ultimate
closed doors,
sophistication.
right in front of the
While his
television sets that were
competitors in the
becoming
late
popular at
90s
the
were
exact
chasing these
same
loud,
time.
maximalist
The mass
trends
adoption
and
of AC
elaborate,
also kicked
over-the-top
off a
prints,
massive Sunbelt
Calvin Klein
migration.
methodically
Millions
clawed
of
his
Americans
company
out
out
of debt
north who
by
would have
just
never even
simplifying
considered
everything.
moving to Phoenix,
He focused
Miami, or
entirely
Houston,
on clean
suddenly had a
lines,
reason to go.
neutral
Cheap
tones,
housing,
and
lower
placing
taxes,
one
and
simple,
climate-controlled
elegant
comfort
logo
all year
on a
round.
single
Populations
elastic waistband.
exploded down
That was
south,
it.
and congressional
And
seats
guys,
naturally
this
followed.
unbelievable
So the mass
resilience
adoption of air
culminated in
conditioning
December
literally
2003,
redrew the
after
electoral
literally
map of the United
decades
States.
of grinding through the most
Okay,
extreme
moving on
peaks
to
and
our
valleys.
final chapter,
He and Barry Schwartz
Section
finally
5,
sold the company
the
to Phillips
ultimate
Van
fallback.
Heusen. With this
Now,
masterful
if you
mix
think
of
the story
cash,
ends
stock,
with air
and
conditioning
future
shoving the
performance
electric
royalties,
fan into
the
the
total
attic to
payout
gather
was
dust
nearly
forever,
$700
you'd be
million.
mistaken.
They
In
took a
October of
$10,000 gamble
1973,
and built
the
it into
world
an
basically
absolute
ran out of
dynasty.
cheap energy.
Which
An
brings
oil
us to the
embargo
most
spiked
important
prices,
takeaway of this whole
electricity
explainer,
bills
our
doubled,
final Empire
and power
secret.
grids were
Leverage
straining
your
under the
perceived
massive demand of
weaknesses.
millions of AC
Throughout
units.
his life, critics
Power
thought
companies
Calvin
were
was,
practically
you know,
begging
too
people to
quiet,
raise their
too
thermostats.
sensitive.
Maybe
And
too
what
much
did
of a
Americans
sketchy
do?
loner to
They
ever
rushed
survive the
straight to
brutal
the hardware
garment
store.
district.
But those
Ceiling fan
exact
sales
traits
alone
allowed
jumped
him to
from
observe what
200,000
everyone
to
else
over
missed.
3.5
He saw that
million
simplicity
by
was the
1980.
real language
The
of luxury.
fan proved its
His
immense
perceived
resilience.
weaknesses were
When cheap
secretly
energy
his greatest
vanished, the
empire-building
trusty fan
assets
was
all
right
along.
there waiting in the
Like
attic.
the famous quote goes,
And that trend
design is not just what it
absolutely
looks like.
continues today.
Design is how it
Despite
works.
the sheer
It wasn't
dominance
enough
of
to
central
just
air
look
conditioning,
successful on
the
a massive
simple, cheap
billboard.
electric fan
His empire
remains
had
one
to
of the most
actually
produced
function.
and necessary
It had to
appliances in
survive
human
intense
history.
federal
Over
investigations, inflation,
100
crushing
million
junk
units are
bonds,
sold
and
every
relentless
single year
boardroom
in the
crises.
US alone,
And somehow,
over
against all
500
odds,
million
by
globally.
applying that same
They're
meticulous
spinning
design
away in
philosophy
server
directly
rooms,
to his business
bedrooms, and
structure,
hospital wards
it
on
actually
literally
did.
every continent.
So, as we wrap up
What
this
you should
incredible
really take
case
away from
study
this
of
explainer
survival
is
and
the
success,
fans'
I
unsung
want to leave you with
legacy.
one vital
Everybody
question to
credits
ponder
AC
as you
for the
build your
modern
own
Sun
path.
Belt.
And
Hey,
how
it
can you
definitely
turn your
deserves
own
that credit.
perceived
But
weaknesses
AC
into your
arrived after the
greatest empire
foundations of
building
Houston,
advantage?
Atlanta,
Think
and
about it.
Dallas were
Take a
already
page
laid.
right out of the
It
Calvin
was the
Klein
electric
playbook,
fan that
embrace
served as that
exactly what makes you
absolutely
different,
critical
and
40-year
just start
bridge.
building.
The
Thanks
fan
so
didn't
much for
conquer
joining
the
me on
heat,
this
but it
explainer.
held
I'll
the
catch
door
you
open
next time.